The crisp morning air at Atlanta International Airport buzzed with the usual symphony of rolling suitcases and hurried footsteps. Among the sea of travelers, a man in his early 40s stood out, not because he was trying to, but because of the quiet confidence he carried. His charcoal gray suit was perfectly pressed, and his leather briefcase showed signs of frequent travel. A true road warrior who knew the ins and outs of air travel. As the newly appointed CEO of Pacific Airways, he had made it his personal mission to experience his airline just like any other passenger would. No special treatment, no announcements, no VIP escorts. He believed that real leadership meant understanding exactly what his customers experienced, from the check-in counter to the baggage claim. The morning sun streamed through the terminal's massive windows as he made his way to Gate B-23. He'd done this walk hundreds of times before, but today felt different. This wasn't just another business trip. It was his first flight since taking the helm of the company 2 weeks ago. His colleagues had insisted on special arrangements, but he had politely declined. How can I improve the airline if I don't know what our passengers really go through? He had told them. He smiled warmly at the gate agent as he handed over his boarding pass. First class, seat 2A. The agent returned his smile, completely unaware that the man standing before her was now the highest-ranking executive in the company. That's exactly how he wanted it. Walking down the jet bridge, he adjusted his tie and took a deep breath. The familiar smell of airplane cabin welcomed him as he stepped aboard. The lead flight attendant greeted him with the same professional courtesy extended to all first-class passengers. Perfect. No special treatment, just as he had requested. Settling into his leather seat, he couldn't help but feel a hint of pride. Not because of his position, but because of what it represented. 25 years ago, he had started as a baggage handler for this very airline, working night shifts to put himself through business school. Now he was here, not just as a passenger, but as someone who could make real change happen. He pulled out his laptop, planning to review some passenger satisfaction reports before takeoff. The irony wasn't lost on him, studying customer experiences while having one himself. Other passengers began boarding, the usual mix of business travelers and vacationers filtering past him to their seats. As he typed quietly on his laptop, he observed the small details around him. The way the flight attendants interacted with passengers, the cleanliness of the cabin, the efficiency of the boarding process, everything that passengers experienced but might not consciously notice. He made mental notes, already thinking of ways to enhance the little things that could make a big difference. The boarding continued smoothly, the cabin gradually filling with a soft murmur of conversations and the sound of overhead bins clicking shut. Everything was proceeding normally, just another morning flight from Atlanta to San Francisco. Little did he know that in just a few minutes, this routine flight would become anything but ordinary, and his decision to fly incognito would lead to an encounter that would change not just his airline, but perhaps the way people think about prejudice in modern society. He closed his laptop and looked out the window, watching the ground crew prepare the aircraft for departure. 25 years of aviation experience had taught him that every flight told a story. But the story that was about to unfold on this particular morning would be one that nobody aboard could have predicted. The peaceful atmosphere in first class was suddenly disrupted by the sharp click of heels against the airplane's floor. A well-dressed woman in her 50s, clutching a designer handbag that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, stopped abruptly at row 2. She glanced at her boarding pass, then at the man sitting by the window, and her expression shifted from surprise to visible displeasure. Instead of speaking to him directly, she raised her hand, beckoning a flight attendant with the kind of wave usually reserved for summoning waiters at high-end restaurants. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone that suggested she was about to make someone's day much more difficult. There seems to be some confusion about the seating arrangements. The flight attendant approached with a professional smile, though she couldn't have missed the tension already building in the air. "How may I help you, ma'am?" The woman gestured toward the CEO, as if he wasn't even there, speaking in a stage whisper that was clearly meant to be heard by everyone nearby. "I believe there's been a mistake with the seating. I paid quite a premium for first class, and I'm sure—" She paused, giving a pointed look at the man's seat. "There must be some mix-up here." Other passengers were starting to take notice now. A businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper. 2 rows back, someone quietly slipped out their phone. The whole scene was becoming uncomfortably familiar to anyone who had seen similar situations play out before. The CEO remained focused on his laptop screen, his fingers still on the keyboard, but he'd stopped typing. Years of experience in corporate meetings had taught him how to maintain composure while listening intently. The only sign that he'd heard anything was a slight tightening around his eyes. "Ma'am," the flight attendant began diplomatically, "all our passengers in first class have been assigned their correct seats. If you'd like, I can double-check your boarding pass." "No, you don't understand," the woman cut in, her voice getting louder. "I specifically booked this flight because of its reputation. I'm a frequent flyer, and I expect certain—" She glanced around the cabin meaningfully, standards to be maintained. A few rows back, an elderly couple exchanged knowing looks. A young woman in a business suit shook her head slightly, her face showing a mix of embarrassment and anger at what she was witnessing. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from routine morning flight to something more charged, more uncomfortable. The CEO finally looked up from his laptop. His expression remained neutral, but there was a quiet dignity in the way he reached for his boarding pass. He didn't speak, not yet. He simply held it out, his movements deliberate and calm, like someone who had weathered storms far bigger than this. The woman wasn't done, though. She pulled out her phone, making a show of scrolling through her emails. "I have status with this airline. I've been flying first class for 20 years, and I've never experienced such a—" She paused again, searching for words that wouldn't sound explicitly discriminatory while making her prejudices clear— situation. The flight attendant glanced at the CEO's boarding pass, then back at the woman, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the increasingly tense situation. More phones had come out now, their cameras discreetly recording what was unfolding. In the age of social media, moments like these rarely stayed private for long. Just then, another flight attendant appeared in the aisle, responding to the commotion. The woman seemed to take this as reinforcement, straightening her designer jacket as if preparing for battle. She had no idea that her next words would set in motion a chain of events that would make her regret ever boarding this flight. The situation was spiraling quickly, like a pot about to boil over. The woman's voice grew louder with each passing moment, drawing unwanted attention from passengers still boarding the plane. "I want to speak to someone in charge," she demanded, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping her phone tightly. "This is completely unacceptable." The 2 flight attendants exchanged quick glances, years of experience telling them this was more than just a typical seating dispute. The first attendant tried again, her voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, I can assure you that everyone in first class has been assigned their correct seats. If you'd like to show me your boarding pass—" "Oh, I'll show you more than that," the woman interrupted, furiously scrolling through her phone. "I have receipts for every first-class flight I've taken with this airline. I'm a platinum member." She thrust her phone forward, displaying her airline status page like a shield. "And I've never had to deal with this kind of situation before." The CEO remained remarkably composed, though anyone watching closely might have noticed how his hands had stilled completely over his laptop keyboard. The dignity in his silence spoke volumes, a sharp contrast to the woman's increasing agitation. A young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, peeked over the seat in front from economy class, her curious eyes taking in the scene. Her mother quickly pulled her back down, whispering something that made the child's eyes go wide with understanding. It was the kind of moment that made adults realize how their behavior could shape the next generation's views. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," the woman continued, though her actions suggested otherwise. But surely you can see that there might have been some confusion at check-in. Perhaps someone was upgraded by mistake. Her emphasis on the word mistake made several nearby passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. The second flight attendant stepped forward, clipboard in hand. "Ma'am, what exactly seems to be the problem with your seat assignment?" It was a tactical question. Forcing the woman to state her actual complaint might make her realize how it would sound out loud. The woman lowered her voice to what she probably thought was a discreet whisper, but in the confined space of the aircraft, her words carried clearly. "Look, I paid over $1,000 for this seat. I think I have the right to question when things don't seem appropriate." More phones were recording now. A businessman in the front row had his camera pointedly aimed at the scene, while pretending to read something on his screen. In row 4, a college student was typing rapidly on her phone, probably live tweeting the entire incident. The CEO finally moved, calmly closing his laptop and storing it in the seat pocket in front of him. His movements were measured, like someone who had made an important decision after careful consideration. He reached into his jacket pocket, and for a moment, everyone seemed to hold their breath, wondering what would happen next. The woman mistook his movement as surrender. "See?" she said triumphantly to the flight attendants. "He's probably realized his mistake. I knew there had to be some mix-up." She clutched her designer bag closer, as if preparing to claim her rightful seat. What she didn't realize was that the CEO wasn't reaching for his things to leave. Instead, he pulled out a small leather wallet, the kind that held more than just credit cards. The kind that contained an airline executive ID badge. The tension in the cabin had reached its peak. Other passengers had stopped pretending not to watch, all eyes now fixed on what was unfolding in row 2. The next few moments would teach everyone on board a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. The leather wallet opened with a soft creak, but before the CEO could reveal its contents, the woman launched into another tirade. "I've already called my husband," she announced, as if this detail somehow strengthened her position. "He's a partner at his law firm, and he agrees this whole situation is completely inappropriate." The CEO paused, his ID badge still hidden from view. His response, when it finally came, was so quiet that people had to lean in to hear it. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had dealt with prejudice his entire life. "I understand you're upset. But I think we both know this isn't about seat assignments." His words hung in the air like suspended raindrops before a storm. The woman's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. For the first time since the confrontation began, she seemed unsure of herself. A flight attendant who had been watching from the galley suddenly straightened up, her eyes widening as she recognized something about the CEO. She started walking toward them, but he caught her eye and gave a subtle shake of his head. He wanted this to play out naturally. I simply want to ensure everything is in order," the woman stammered, her confidence wavering as she faced his calm dignity. "You have to understand, first class has certain expectations." "Yes, it does," he agreed, his voice still measured. "Expectations of courtesy, respect, and professionalism." He looked directly at her for the first time. "The same expectations I have for every employee of this airline." The woman's perfectly penciled eyebrows drew together in confusion. "Employee? I don't understand what you—" He finally withdrew his ID badge, holding it up without fanfare. The golden logo of Pacific Airways caught the cabin light, and beneath it, his title was clearly visible: Chief Executive Officer. The reaction in the cabin was immediate. Someone in row 3 let out a low whistle. The college student who had been live tweeting frantically began typing again. The businessman with the phone camera smiled broadly, knowing he had captured something extraordinary. The color drained from the woman's face so quickly that one of the flight attendants actually took a step forward, concerned she might faint. Her designer bag slipped from her grasp and landed with a soft thud on the floor. I had no idea," she sputtered, her voice barely a whisper now. I never meant to. I know exactly what you meant, the CEO replied, his tone still remarkably kind despite everything. And that's why we need to have a conversation about it. Not just you and me, but all of us. He gestured to the cabin around them. Because every person who steps onto one of my planes deserves to feel welcome, regardless of what they look like or what assumptions others might make about them. The woman's face had turned from pale to bright red. Her earlier bravado had evaporated completely, replaced by the dawning horror of someone who realized they had just made a terrible, terrible mistake. The mention of her husband's law firm seemed almost comical now. Out of the corner of his eye, the CEO noticed the young girl from earlier peeking over the seat again. This time, her mother didn't pull her back. Instead, they both watched, witnessing a moment that would probably become a story told for years to come. The tension in the cabin had shifted. What had started as discomfort at witnessing discrimination had transformed into something else. A collective holding of breath as everyone waited to see how this powerful man would handle someone who had just publicly humiliated herself through her own prejudice. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed completely. The lead flight attendant stepped forward, finally understanding why their mysterious passenger had asked to fly without any special treatment. "Sir," she began, her voice carrying a new note of respect, "would you like me to handle this situation?" Before the CEO could respond, the woman found her voice again, though it had lost all its previous arrogance. "Please," she said quickly, "this is all just a misunderstanding. I never meant to cause any trouble. If I had known who you were." "That's exactly the problem," the CEO interrupted gently. "It shouldn't matter who I am. Whether I'm the CEO or a schoolteacher or a mechanic, every passenger deserves the same respect." A murmur of agreement rippled through the first-class cabin. In row 5, an elderly man nodded vigorously, while the college student who'd been documenting everything had finally put down her phone, too engrossed in the unfolding scene to keep typing. The woman clutched her boarding pass like a lifeline, her hands trembling slightly. "I'll gather my things," she whispered. "I can take another flight." "No," the CEO said firmly, surprising everyone. "You'll stay right here in first class." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "But I hope you'll use this flight to think about why you immediately assumed I didn't belong here." The second flight attendant, who had been standing quietly nearby, suddenly remembered protocol. "Sir, would you like to file a formal complaint?" "As CEO, you cooled." He raised his hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "What I'd like," he said, looking around the cabin, "is for all of us to learn something today." His gaze returned to the woman, who seemed to be shrinking into herself with each passing moment. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from our most uncomfortable moments. A baby started crying somewhere in economy class, breaking the tension slightly. The woman finally picked up her designer bag from the floor, her movements uncertain. She looked like someone trying to wake up from an embarrassing dream, only to realize it was all too real. "I need to call my husband back," she mumbled, fumbling with her phone. "I should tell him. I need to tell him." She trailed off, seemingly unable to find the words to explain how spectacularly her complaints had backfired. The CEO turned to the flight attendants. "I think we can begin boarding the rest of the passengers now," he said quietly. "We don't want to delay the flight." Then, to everyone's surprise, he stood up and helped the woman put her carry-on bag in the overhead compartment, as if the last 10 minutes hadn't happened. The woman stared at him, bewildered by this simple act of kindness. "Why would you?" she began, but couldn't finish. "Because change starts with small gestures," he replied. "And because tomorrow, you might be the one who helps someone else feel welcome instead of out of place." The other first-class passengers watched this exchange with varying expressions, some impressed, others moved, and a few perhaps examining their own prejudices. The businessman who had recorded everything finally lowered his phone, looking somewhat ashamed about documenting someone's worst moment. As the rest of the passengers began filing past, Many did double takes at the scene in first class. The story of what had happened was already spreading through the cabin in whispered conversations. But something unexpected was about to happen. Something that would turn this uncomfortable incident into a moment of genuine transformation. Just as the last few passengers were settling into their seats, a commotion near the cockpit drew everyone's attention. The first officer had emerged, his uniform crisp and his captain's stripes gleaming under the cabin lights. He walked purposefully toward row 2, where the tension from earlier still lingered in the air. "Good morning, sir," he said, approaching the CEO with a warm smile. "I apologize for not greeting you earlier. We're honored to have you aboard today." His voice carried clearly through the cabin, causing several heads to turn. The woman in the adjacent seat seemed to shrink even further into herself, if that was possible. The reality of her situation was becoming more painfully apparent with each passing moment. Not only had she humiliated herself in front of a plane full of passengers, but she had done so to the very person who could potentially ban her from the airline for life. The first officer continued, "We were surprised to see your name on the manifest. Usually, when executives fly, I prefer to experience things just as our passengers do," the CEO interrupted gently. "It helps me understand what we're doing right, and what we need to improve." He glanced meaningfully at the woman beside him. "Today has been particularly educational." A flight attendant passing by nearly dropped her clipboard when she realized who he was. Word was spreading quickly through the crew now, creating a buzz of excited whispers. The woman who had caused the earlier scene looked like she wanted her designer seat to swallow her whole. "Sir," the first officer said, lowering his voice slightly, though in the quiet cabin, his words were still clearly audible. "Would you like to come up to the cockpit before we take off? It's traditional for." The CEO shook his head, smiling. "Thank you, but I'd rather stay right here. I think there are some important conversations that need to happen during this flight." He turned to the woman beside him, who was now staring intently at her phone, though her screen was black. The first officer nodded understanding, but before he turned to leave, he couldn't help adding, "You know, sir, what you've done with the airline's diversity initiatives has been incredible. My daughter just entered the pilot training program, and she says the new inclusive policies made all the difference." The woman's head snapped up at this, her eyes widening slightly. It was as if each new piece of information was another crack in the wall of her prejudices. One of the passengers who had recorded the earlier incident had tears in her eyes. She stood up suddenly, starting to clap. The applause spread through the cabin like a wave, growing louder as more people joined in. It wasn't just about the CEO's handling of the situation anymore. It was a collective statement against discrimination. The woman who had caused the scene finally looked up, her face a complex mix of emotions. Shame, certainly, but there was something else there too. Perhaps the first stirrings of understanding. She watched as passengers from all walks of life, all backgrounds, joined in a spontaneous ovation. The CEO raised his hand, gently quieting the applause. "Please," he said, his voice carrying that same calm authority, "let's not make this about me. Let's make it about doing better, about being better, all of us, every day." As the first officer returned to the cockpit and the flight attendants began their pre-flight checks, something subtle but significant had shifted in the cabin atmosphere. What had started as an ugly display of prejudice was transforming into something else entirely. A moment of collective reflection, and perhaps the beginning of real change. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the woman who had caused the scene finally broke her long silence. Her voice was barely above a whisper, different from her earlier demanding tone. "I want to apologize," she said, staring at her hands folded in her lap. "Not because you're the CEO, but because I was wrong." The CEO looked away from his window, studying her face carefully. The past hour had aged her somehow, not physically, but in the way that comes from having your entire worldview challenged in public. "You know," he said thoughtfully, 25 years ago, I was loading bags onto planes like this one. He paused as a flight attendant passed with a drink cart. I worked nights, studied during the day, and dreamed of sitting up here in first class. Not as a passenger, but as someone who helped run the airline. A few rows back, passengers were pretending not to listen, but their suspended conversations and tilted heads gave them away. The college student had her phone out again, but this time she was just taking notes, captured by the story unfolding before her. Every morning, I'd watch people like you board the plane, he continued. Some would look right through me, like I was invisible. Others would clutch their bags tighter when I came near, even in my uniform. But there were also those who smiled, who said thank you, who treated me like a human being. The woman's eyes had begun to water. She pulled a tissue from her designer bag, dabbing at them carefully to preserve her makeup. I never thought. I didn't realize. That's the thing about prejudice, he said gently. It doesn't just hurt the person you're judging. It limits you too. How many amazing conversations have you missed? How many potential friendships have you lost? How many brilliant minds have you dismissed, just because of what you thought you saw? A baby gurgled somewhere in the cabin, and the CEO smiled. That child, he said, nodding toward the sound, will grow up in a world that's different from the one you and I knew. But how different? That depends on people like us, on the choices we make every single day. The woman turned in her seat to fully face him, her expression open for the first time since boarding. What can I do? She asked, and the question seemed to come from somewhere genuine. How do I fix this? It starts with awareness, he replied. And it seems to me you've had quite an awakening today. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a business card. But if you're serious about making changes, I have a suggestion. Several passengers leaned forward slightly, curious about what was coming next. Even the flight attendants slowed their service, eager to hear his response. Our airline has a community outreach program, he explained, handing her the card. We work with schools in underprivileged areas, mentoring students who dream of careers in aviation. They need volunteers, people who can share their business experience, help with interview skills, maybe even provide internship opportunities. The woman took the card with trembling fingers, staring at it as if it were a lifeline. You trust me to do that? After how I behaved. Sometimes, he said, the people who learn the hardest lessons become the most passionate advocates for change. He smiled. And something tells me you have quite a story to share now. Around them, the cabin had grown quiet. Not the tense silence from earlier, but the kind of hush that falls when people are witnessing something meaningful. Even the young girl who had watched the earlier drama unfold was listening intently, absorbing a lesson that no classroom could teach as effectively. The plane had been cruising smoothly for about an hour when the CEO made an unexpected decision. He pressed the flight attendant call button, and when she arrived, he whispered something that made her eyes light up with understanding. She nodded and hurried off toward economy class. A few minutes later, she returned with 2 passengers. A young man wearing a worn backpack and carrying a thick medical textbook, and an elderly woman clutching a photo of what appeared to be her grandchildren. The CEO stood up, drawing curious glances from nearby passengers. We have 2 empty seats here in first class, he announced, loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear. And I'd like to offer them to these passengers. He gestured to the 2 people standing uncertainly in the aisle. This young man is flying to a medical conference where he's presenting research on childhood diseases. And this grandmother is traveling to meet her newborn grandchild for the first time. The woman who had caused the earlier scene watched this unfold, understanding dawning on her face. This wasn't just about upgrading passengers. It was about challenging perceptions about who belonged in first class. The young medical student started to protest. Sir, I couldn't possibly. Please, the CEO interrupted warmly. Consider it an investment in our future. One day, you might be treating my grandchildren. He turned to the elderly woman, who had tears in her eyes. And you, ma'am, deserve to arrive rested and comfortable for your big moment. As the flight attendants helped them settle into their new seats, the CEO continued speaking, his voice carrying naturally through the cabin. You see, luxury isn't about who can afford it. It's about recognizing and celebrating human achievement in all its forms, whether that's years of medical study or the lifetime of love that makes someone travel across the country to meet their newest family member. The woman who had questioned his presence earlier was watching everything with new eyes. She reached into her designer bag and pulled out a pack of tissues, offering one to the grandmother who was still wiping away happy tears. The medical student had placed his textbook on the tray table, and the CEO glanced at it with interest. Tell me about your research, he said, genuinely curious. What inspired you to focus on childhood diseases? As the young man began explaining his work, other passengers listened in. The college student who had been documenting everything was now fully engaged in the conversation, asking intelligent questions about medical research. The businessman who had recorded the earlier incident had put away his phone completely, drawn into the discussion. The elderly woman pulled out her phone, showing pictures of her other grandchildren to anyone who would look. The same passengers who had been uncomfortably witnessing discrimination an hour ago were now sharing in her joy and excitement. The woman who had caused the scene sat quietly, watching this transformation of the cabin's atmosphere. She saw how easily barriers could break down, how quickly prejudices could dissolve when people simply talked to each other as human beings. I've been so blind, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. But the CEO heard her. We all have our moments of blindness, he replied softly. The important thing is what we do once our eyes are opened. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with renewed energy, serving drinks and snacks to the first-class passengers, both old and new. The young girl from economy class had peeked over the seat again, this time watching in wonder as the medical student explained his research using simple terms she could understand. What had started as an ugly incident of discrimination had transformed into something beautiful, a microcosm of what society could be when people looked past their preconceptions and saw each other's humanity. As the plane began its descent into San Francisco, the story of what had happened in first class had already gone viral. The college students' live tweets had been shared thousands of times, and several passengers' videos were trending on social media. But something unexpected was happening in the comments. Instead of the usual angry pile-on, people were sharing their own stories of transformation and learning. The CEO's phone had been buzzing nonstop with messages from his team. News outlets were requesting interviews, and social media was exploding with praise for how he had handled the situation. But he kept his phone on silent, more interested in the real changes happening right in front of him. The woman who had caused the scene was having a quiet conversation with the elderly grandmother, helping her fill out the arrival forms with shaking hands. The medical student was showing the young girl from economy class a simplified diagram from his textbook, explaining how medicines help people get better. Sir, a flight attendant approached the CEO, holding a tablet. You might want to see this. Our company's social media is getting flooded with messages. People are sharing their own experiences with prejudice, but also stories about overcoming it. Your actions today, they've started something bigger. He glanced at the tablet, seeing hashtags like hashtag #FirstClassHumanity and hashtag #ChangeStartsWithUs trending. But what caught his eye were the comments from airline employees worldwide, sharing their own stories of facing discrimination and standing up against it. The woman who had questioned his presence overheard this and turned to him, her voice thick with emotion. I've been reading the responses on my phone, she admitted. So many people are saying they've been in my position, not just judging others, but having that moment when they realized how wrong they were. She paused, gathering courage. I'd like to post my own response, if you'll allow it. Not to defend what I did, but to show others that people can change. The plane touched down smoothly, and as passengers began gathering their belongings, something remarkable happened. The businessman who had recorded everything stood up and addressed the cabin. I think we all witnessed something extraordinary today. Not just the incident, but how it was handled. I've learned more about leadership and humanity in these few hours than in years of corporate training. Others joined in, sharing what the experience had meant to them. The college student announced she was changing her thesis topic to study the impact of positive leadership in addressing social bias. The young girl from economy class declared she wanted to become a pilot, just like the CEO. As passengers began to deplane, the CEO stood and helped the elderly grandmother with her bag. The woman who had caused the scene did the same for the medical student, an act of service that would have seemed impossible hours earlier. The next day, Pacific Airways announced a new initiative inspired by the flight. They created a program called First Class Humanity, offering mentorship opportunities and travel vouchers to underprivileged students interested in aviation careers. The woman who had learned such a public lesson became one of its first volunteers. The story continued to spread, but not just as another viral moment of public shame. Instead, it became a teaching tool, shared in corporate training sessions and school discussions about bias and redemption. The CEO received thousands of letters from people sharing their own stories of change and growth. A month later, when the medical student presented his research at the conference, he opened with this story, talking about how prejudice can blind us to human potential. The elderly grandmother shared the tale with her newborn grandchild's siblings, teaching them early lessons about judging others. As the CEO walked through the terminal that first evening, he passed a wall of departure screens. Each one showed planes taking off to different destinations, carrying people with their own stories, prejudices, and possibilities for change. He smiled, knowing that sometimes the most important journeys aren't measured in miles, but in the distance between who we are and who we can become.